It's ripped. Just pin it and move on. Don't make this into a scene. Your sister's dealing with enough stress right now. My mother said this without lifting her eyes from her phone, completely indifferent to the fact that my dress uniform, the one I needed for the most important interview of my career, now had a long, violent tear running across the chest. My sister Brooke had done it with a knife from the kitchen block. It was the night before I was set to walk into the Pentagon, and I'd only come home that weekend because my commanding officer had ordered me to keep up appearances during my background review. Brooke's jealousy had torn through more than fabric. It felt like she'd torn through 4 years of my life, 3,200 hours of service in a combat support hospital, reduced to a slashed jacket and a mother who wouldn't even look up. That next morning, I used safety pins to hold the uniform together and walked into that interview with my spine straight and my collar crooked. General Marcus Reed frowned the second he saw the tear. I thought that was it. I thought I was about to be sent home for violating dress code before I ever opened my mouth. Then his eyes dropped to my name tag, and his whole face changed. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper he'd apparently been holding onto for over a year. His voice, when it finally came, was unsteady. "Wait. Are you the one she wrote about?" I stared at that paper in his hand, and my mind dropped straight back 4 years to a room that still owned a piece of me. The Pentagon office, the cold air, the silence, all of it disappeared, and I was 22 again, standing on the rug in the middle of my father's study back at the house outside Charleston. The room smelled like old books and cigars, the walls covered in 3 generations of military honors, my father's Distinguished Service Medal, my grandfather's Silver Star, unit citations going back decades. Not one plaque had my name on it. There was a gap on the wall, deliberately left empty, waiting for Brooke. I just told my father I wanted to become a combat medic, frontline, no desk job, no safety net. I expected at least a nod. Instead, he slammed his hand on the desk hard enough to rattle the frames. "Your logistics material, Nathan. You were never built to lead." He didn't even stand up to say it. My mother stood behind him with a glass of wine, gave him a small, satisfied nod, and took a sip like she just watched a business deal close in her favor. She'd rehearsed this. She'd built the whole scene and handed him the lines. I understood something in that moment I'd been avoiding for years. My parents weren't just ignoring me. They were actively working to keep me small so Brooke's manufactured shine would never be challenged. That night I packed a duffel bag, boots, 2 sets of fatigues, a Bible my grandmother left me, and enlisted without telling a single person in my family. I asked for the hardest postings available. I traded champagne receptions for iodine and diesel fumes. While Brooke slept in the apartment our parents rented for her in D.C., I slept in a barracks with pipes that groaned all night. I bought my own dog tags with my first paycheck and made myself a promise standing in the mud during a freezing morning drill. I would never call home with good news again. I would build something of my own, far from their shadow, and I would stop waiting to be loved by people who'd already decided who deserved it. While I was hauling supply crates across a frozen tarmac, my mother was spending real money to build Brooke a career out of nothing: private coaches, image consultants, staged training photos with camouflage that had never touched dirt, boots that had never been laced by the person wearing them. Years later, when I finally pulled the security logs myself, the numbers didn't lie. Brooke's total time on an actual training ground over 3 years came to 5 hours and 22 minutes. I'd logged over 3,200 hours in a single ward. That ward was at Camp Delaney, and that's where I met Lily. She was 7. A war orphan, thin as a coat hanger, fighting a physical decline the doctors couldn't fully explain. Her mother, Karen, sat in the corner on a plastic chair, crying quietly while doctors talked over her in language she wasn't given time to understand. One morning, a medevac helicopter thundered low over the roof, rattling the windows, and Lily curled into a ball, hands over her ears, panicking. The sound had carried her father away for the last time, and her body knew it before her mind could catch up. I dropped my clipboard, got down on the floor next to her bed, and took her hands. "That sound isn't taking anyone away today," I told her. "It's bringing someone home. You're a fighter too, Lily. I'm not going anywhere." She grabbed my collar and held on like I was the only solid thing in the room. Karen sank back into her chair and wept with relief. I stayed. I pulled double shifts, sat in that same plastic chair until my back ached, and read to her through the worst of it, everything from adventure stories to, at her insistence, the entire maintenance manual for a Black Hawk, because she said machines were less scary once you understood them. Every morning, no matter how weak she got, she'd point toward the window at the helipad and whisper, "The sun's up again, Nathan." I'm still fighting. Sergeant First Class Tom Bryant, a man who didn't show much of anything, quietly documented every one of those months. 38 official reports, all landing on the same conclusion. The patient's condition remained stable because of the consistent presence of First Lieutenant N. Cole. Mine. Not anyone else's. As autumn set in, Lily started to fade for good. A few days before she passed, she asked her mother to sit with a pen and paper and dictated a letter to the generals who decide who gets to lead. Then, with what strength she had left, she drew one more sunrise over the helipad and flipped the page over to write 5 shaking words on the back. She pressed the paper into my hand and held on as tight as she could. She died fighting the way she'd fought every morning before that. At her funeral, I stood in my dress uniform and saluted a casket the size of a schoolbook. Weeks later, at a Pentagon tribute event for fallen service members and their families, I watched from across the ballroom as Karen approached Colonel Patricia Hale, the officer who'd overseen Lily's care, and handed her that folded letter. "Please make sure this gets to whoever decides Nathan's future," she said. Colonel Hale carried it straight to General Reed, who read the first few lines and went still. That same night in the same room, Karen found my mother and handed her something else, Lily's crayon drawing of the sunrise, the last gift she'd ever made. My mother smiled warmly, promised to deliver it safely, squeezed Karen's hand, and the moment Karen's back was turned, her expression went cold. She folded the drawing, shoved it in her purse, drove home, and buried it in her dresser drawer under a pile of silk scarves. A dying child's final wish, hidden so I'd never have a reason to feel proud of anything. Months after the funeral, still numb with grief, I sat alone in my barracks after an 18-hour shift and opened our family's shared cloud drive on my laptop. I wrote everything down: Lily, Karen, the sunrises, the sound of her voice cracking on the word fighting but saying it anyway. It wasn't meant for anyone. It was just me finally putting the weight down somewhere. I saved it in a private folder and told myself it would stay that way. A few nights later, my mother logged into that same drive from her home office and found it. She read every page without a flicker of sympathy. Then she picked up her phone and texted my father, "Just read Nathan's file. The story about the girl is exactly what we need. Brooke's application is too weak. We're using this for her." My father, to his very small credit, typed back a half-hearted objection. My mother crushed it in one line: "He's logistics. Brooke is the one with a future. This gets her to general rank." My father read it, said nothing back, and put his phone face down on the desk. That silence was as good as a signature. Within 48 hours, Brooke had copied my memoir word for word, stripped my name out, and submitted it as her own personal essay for the Pentagon's Senior Strategic Leadership Scholarship. The review board was moved to tears. She won the seat without ever setting foot in that ward. The memory let go of me all at once, and I was back in General Reed's office, staring at Lily's letter in his hand. His eyes moved from my torn uniform to the paper and back again. I watched him do the math, the same names, the same ward, the same helicopter, the same little girl, except the letter was addressed to First Lieutenant Nathan Cole. Not Second Lieutenant Brooke Cole. A few weeks earlier, a scheduling gap at the Pentagon had forced Major Angela Ruiz to push me into a late application for that same scholarship. When Brooke found out I'd been called in for an interview, she'd screamed at our mother for an hour and put a hole in the living room wall. I'd assumed it was just her usual jealousy. Standing there with the general's letter between us, I understood. She knew that the second I opened my mouth about Lily, her stolen essay would collapse. That's why she took a knife to my uniform. It wasn't a tantrum. It was an attempt to get me disqualified before I ever spoke. I ran through the breathing drills I'd used under fire. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The anger didn't fade, it just went cold and sharp. By the time I looked up, the words mother, father, and sister had stopped meaning family. They were targets now. General Reed saw it happen in real time. He gave one small nod, like a man who'd seen this shift before, the moment someone decides grief is going to become strategy. The moment I left the Pentagon, I drove straight to Major Ruiz's office and asked her to pull the raw hospital logs. She didn't ask why. She just typed in her clearance code and let the numbers speak. 3,200 hours logged against Brooke's 5 hours and 22 minutes. Proof my sister had never set foot in that ward. I called my mother from Major Ruiz's office, kept my voice flat, and asked one question. Did Brooke's essay mention a girl named Lily Turner? 5 seconds of silence. Then what are you talking about? She never asked who Lily was. She never asked what essay. The panic in her voice told me everything her words tried to hide. That night I stayed up drafting a 15-page grievance for the Pentagon Disciplinary Board, the security logs, the cloud drive timestamps showing my mother's midnight login, the metadata proving my memoir existed months before Brooke's submission, Sergeant Bryant's 38 reports lining up exactly with the ward, the dates, the child, and the essay. I filed it before sunrise, then went for a run because I needed to move. 2 days later, my father asked to meet, off the record, at a diner 12 miles off base. He looked wrecked, wrinkled uniform, no sleep, hands shaking around a coffee cup he never drank. He slid a USB drive across the table. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said. I just want you to know I was wrong to let this happen. The drive held 52 text messages between my parents, every order from my mother, every week agreement from him. I took it, thanked him for cooperating, and told him it didn't buy back what he'd let happen. I walked out and didn't look back. 3 days after I filed the grievance, my mother summoned me home, fully expecting the same quiet son who'd left without a fight 4 years earlier. I sat in the driveway for a full minute before going in, confirming the files were backed up in 3 separate places so nothing she did could erase them. I walked past Brooke's fake tears in the living room and my mother's furious questions in the foyer, went straight up to the master bedroom and tore open her dresser. Under a pile of scarves, I found Lily's drawing, faded but unmistakable. On the back, in shaky crayon, to Nathan, my protector. Lily. I brought it downstairs, laid it flat on the glass dining table hard enough to make the chandelier shake, and looked my mother dead in the eye. This belonged to a dead child, and you buried it so Brooke's reputation would stay clean. She lunged for it. I pinned it down. Brooke slid down the wall behind her, hyperventilating, begging me not to ruin her career. I have the original file, I said. I have the security logs. I have 52 text messages. And now I have this. I turned and walked out, leaving the front door open behind me. At the hearing, I wore the same torn uniform, safety pins and all. I turned down 2 offers of a replacement jacket. Every general on the panel understood exactly what they were looking at before I said a word. Brooks' attorney, Grant Ellis, opened his mouth to start some story about shared family inspiration. I didn't give him the chance. I put the hospital logs on the screen, 3,200 hours against 5 hours and 22 minutes, and then the 52 text messages, time-stamped and verified. Then I brought up a live video link to Karen Turner, sitting in the same small room where Lily used to draw her sunrises. She looked into the camera without flinching. My daughter's dying wish was for Nathan. Diane Cole took that wish and buried it. Grant Ellis had nothing left to say. Brooks' breathing turned ragged enough that the court stenographer paused. General Reed stood, holding the drawing in one hand and the letter in the other, and the board looked at Brooke with a kind of disgust that needed no translation. Through the glass doors, I watched my mother sprinting down the hallway, ready to break decorum and pound on the glass. My father stepped into her path and grabbed her arm. "Haven't you done enough?" It was the first time in 30 years he'd stood against her, and the look on her face said she never saw it coming. I turned back to the board. "I'm not here for revenge," I said. "I'm here so a little girl's voice means something. You can't build a command position on someone else's blood and sweat." The gavel came down. Brooke was recommended for court-martial, discharged, and permanently barred from any position of federal authority. Her name went into the misconduct database. My parents filed for separation within weeks, the whole arrangement collapsing under its own weight. When my mother's messages started coming, accusations, threats, guilt, I read the last one, then blocked her number and set the phone down. A few months later, the Pentagon formally awarded me the scholarship, my name where it should have always been. Before I moved to D.C. for good, I drove 4 hours back to see Karen one last time. She pulled me into a hug that held more warmth than my family had given me in 26 years. She asked me to take off the torn uniform jacket, and with an old sewing kit, she removed each safety pin one at a time, aligned the tier and stitched it closed with gold thread. In the center of the repair, she embroidered a small letter L. "Now Lily's the one protecting you," she said, handing it back. I put the jacket on and felt the stitching settle right over my chest, no longer a wound, but something closer to armor. I packed the drawing between 2 pieces of cardboard for framing at my new desk, got in my truck, and drove toward Washington without once checking the mirror. The sun comes up for the people who keep fighting in the dark. It came up for Lily every single morning until it didn't, and it's been coming up for me ever since. 6 months into my new posting at the Pentagon, I still hadn't unpacked the last box in my apartment. It sat by the door with Lily's drawing on top, wrapped in the same cardboard I'd used for the drive out. I told myself I'd get to the frame shop eventually. Some part of me wasn't ready to let it stop being something I carried. Work kept me from thinking too hard about it. I'd been assigned to the Office of Strategic Personnel Review, a quiet irony, given everything, helping audit exactly the kind of fraud that had almost buried me. My supervisor, Colonel Diane Ashworth, was sharp and unsentimental, the kind of officer who read a file once and remembered every line of it. She never asked about the uniform hanging in my closet with the gold stitching. She didn't need to. My file had made its way around the building long before I had. "You're the one from the Cole case," she said, my first week not as a question. "I'm the one who filed it," I said. She nodded once, the same way General Reed had, and never brought it up again. My father called in March. I almost didn't pick up. We hadn't spoken since the diner, since the USB drive, since he'd stood in that hallway and put his hand on my mother's arm for the first time in 30 years and meant it. "I'm not calling to ask for anything," he said before I could say a word. "I just wanted you to know I sold the house." The house. The study with the empty frame on the wall. The mahogany desk he'd slammed his hand on when I was 22. "Where's the study going?" I asked, not sure why it mattered to me. "Storage unit for now. I kept a few things. I didn't keep the medals." A pause. "I thought about mailing you something, but I didn't think you'd want it coming from me." I told him I didn't need anything from that house. He didn't push. We talked for maybe 4 more minutes, nothing that mattered, whether his new place outside Roanoke, whether I was eating enough, and then we hung up. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even close. But it was the first conversation with him in years that didn't feel like a negotiation. My mother didn't call. I heard through a cousin that she'd moved to Florida, that she'd tried, briefly, to get a civilian consulting job with a defense contractor using the family name, and that the name didn't open the doors it used to. I felt less about that than I expected to. Not satisfaction. Just distance, the kind that comes from a wound finally scarring over instead of bleeding. Brooke I never heard from at all. In April, Karen Turner drove up to D.C. for the scholarship dinner, the first one held in Lily's name. The Pentagon had agreed after the hearing to attach Lily's story to the award going forward, the Lily Turner Memorial Leadership Scholarship, given each year to the applicant whose essay reflected genuine service, verified and cross-checked, no exceptions. It was Major Ruiz's idea. She said the review board owed the real Lily that much. Karen wore a navy dress and carried a small framed photo of Lily in her purse, the way she had every year since the funeral. When she saw me across the room in my dress uniform, repaired now, the gold E catching the light, she didn't say anything at first. She just reached out and touched the stitching, the way she had that afternoon in her living room. She would have liked this room, Karen said. All the noise. She always wanted to see where the helicopters actually landed, you know. Not just hear them. I'll take you sometime, I told her. There's a base about 40 minutes from here. I can get you clearance. She smiled, and for a second she looked like a woman who hadn't spent 3 years grieving in a plastic chair. I gave the keynote that night, the first time I'd told the full story out loud, to a room instead of a tribunal. I didn't dress it up. I told them about the tear in my uniform, about the letter Reed had kept in his drawer for over a year, about Lily pointing at a helipad every morning and refusing to let go of the words, "I'm still fighting," until she physically couldn't say them anymore. I told them what it cost to find out the people who were supposed to protect you had instead been counting on you staying quiet. And I told them what it looked like when someone else, someone with no obligation to you at all, decided to stitch you back together anyway. When I sat back down, General Reed, 3 tables over, raised his glass an inch off the table. Just enough for me to see it. I framed the drawing that weekend. Sunrise over a helipad, drawn in crayon by a hand that was running out of time and used every bit of what was left of it anyway. I hung it across from my desk, where I'd see it every morning before I saw anything else. Some mornings I still expect to hear her voice. "The sun's up again, Nathan. I'm still fighting. I am too, Lily. Every day since." By the following spring, the story had mostly settled into something I could live with instead of something that lived inside me. I'd stopped flinching when a helicopter passed low over the building. I'd stopped rehearsing what I'd say if my mother ever called. The uniform with the gold E hung in a garment bag in my closet, worn only on the anniversary of the hearing, and every time I put it on, it felt less like armor and more like a memory I chose to keep close instead of one I was defending myself from. Colonel Ashworth promoted me that June, Captain Nathan Cole, Office of Strategic Personnel Review, lead investigator on cases involving falsified service records. It wasn't lost on either of us what that meant. I spent my days doing for other soldiers what Major Ruiz had done for me, pulling the logs, checking the timestamps, making sure the person whose name was on the file was the person who'd actually lived it. The work was slow and unglamorous most of the time. But every few months, there'd be a case that mattered, a young sergeant whose combat report had been quietly rewritten by a superior officer angling for a medal, a nurse whose volunteer hours had been claimed by someone higher up the chain. Small thefts in the scheme of things. But I understood better than anyone in that office what it felt like to have your name erased from your own life. I never let one of those cases go unfinished. Karen and I kept in touch. I drove her out to the base that fall like I'd promised and stood with her at the edge of the tarmac while a medevac helicopter came in for a routine landing. She watched it the whole way down, arms crossed, jaw tight, and when it finally touched the ground she let out a breath like she'd been holding it since the day Lily died. She used to be so scared of that sound, Karen said. She wasn't scared of it in the end, I told her. She just decided it meant something different. Karen nodded and didn't say anything else for a while. We stood there until the rotors stopped. She started volunteering at the same hospital not long after that, nothing clinical, just sitting with the kids whose parents couldn't always be there, reading to them the way I used to read to Lily. She said it was the only thing that made the ward feel like something other than the place her daughter died. I understood that completely. My father and I settled into something that wasn't quite a relationship but wasn't nothing either. He came up to D.C. twice that year, both times unannounced, both times just to take me to dinner and talk about nothing important. He never brought up my mother. I never asked. Somewhere in there, without either of us naming it, we'd agreed that the man at the diner with the shaking hands and the USB drive was someone I was willing to know, even if I wasn't willing to forget why he'd needed forgiving in the first place. I heard, eventually, that my mother had left the consulting firm in Florida after less than a year. I didn't ask for details and nobody offered them. Some stories end with the person just fading out of the frame, and I'd made peace with the fact that hers might end that way. I didn't need an ending for her. I already had mine. Brooke sent one letter in the spring after her discharge, care of the Pentagon, forwarded to my new address through channels I never asked about. I read it twice. It wasn't an apology, not really, it was closer to an explanation. All about pressure and expectation and never once feeling like she was allowed to be anything other than what our mother built her to be. I believed some of it. I didn't write back. Some doors you leave unlocked without opening them just so you know they're not the ones keeping you trapped anymore. The following June, at the second annual dinner for the Lily Turner Memorial Scholarship, I watched a 19-year-old combat medic named Priya Anand walk up to the podium to accept the award for 400 documented hours at a field hospital in her first deployment, verified down to the minute, no room for anyone to steal a second of it. Karen sat beside me holding the same small framed photo she always carried, crying the good kind of tears this time. Priya thanked her unit, her family, and then paused and looked out at the room. I never met Lily Turner, she said. But I read her letter before I wrote my essay. She said something in it I haven't been able to shake, that the sun comes up whether you're ready for it or not, and the only thing you get to choose is whether you're still fighting when it does. I looked over at Karen. She reached over and took my hand without looking away from the stage. Afterward, walking out into the parking lot, the sky doing that late June thing where it stays lit long after it should have gone dark, Karen turned to me before we split off toward our cars. You know, she said, I think Lily got exactly what she wanted. Not the scholarship. Not even justice, really. She wanted someone to keep showing up. And you did. I didn't have anything to say to that. I just nodded the way General Reed used to and got in my truck and drove home past the building where the drawing hung across from my desk, waiting for morning like it always had.